It's the Summer of SEGA. Welcome to the next level. Yes, friends, it begins. It is the Summer of SEGA. I'm taking the whole summer to celebrate the launch of the Genesis, which happened in North America 25 years ago this August. To start, we're going to look at a game that actually predates the Genesis. So let's get started with a little history about SEGA the company and our game for this episode. Service Games was started in Hawaii in 1940. They made and distributed pinball, slot machines, jukeboxes, and other various electromechanical devices to U.S. military. They moved the business to Japan in the early 1950s and began importing the same types of games and machines from the U.S. to U.S. military bases in Japan. Their primary competition was Rosen Industries, owned by a man named David Rosen. In 1964, Rosen Industries and Service Games merged to become Sega Enterprises, with Rosen as CEO. In 1966, Sega released their first original arcade game, an electromechanical shooting game called Periscope. It wasn't long before it made its way to America and caught on. It also caught the attention of Gulf and Western, who purchased Sega in 1969. Now that name might not mean a lot to some of my younger viewers, but at one point, Gulf and Western owned Sega, Paramount Pictures, Simon & Schuster Publishing, Madison Square Garden, and many, many other things. They owned Sega until 1983, the year of the great home video game crash, at which point Rosen and Hayao Nakayama purchased it back. 1983 is also the year Sega launched their first home console, the SG-1000. Launched on the same day in Japan as the Nintendo Famicom, or NES, it didn't do well. It was almost identical to the ColecoVision, and the games looked downright antiquated compared to the Famicom. They tried to rally with the SG-1000 Mark II. However, that was just an iteration on the existing hardware, and it also failed to make waves. Historically speaking, that brings us to just about where we need to be. Shortly after that, they released the Mark III, which would be released in America. That would be handled by Tonka, and it would be known as the Sega Master System. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, the Master System didn't make a huge impact, but it got Sega a foothold in the North American console market, and it got a little bit of recognition. Aside from all this console business, Sega was making a killing in the arcades. Games like Zaxxon, Turbo, and others were making a mint for Sega, both in the US and abroad. Sure, arcades had a downturn in the US in '83 and '84, but they'd started to bounce back, and in 1987, Sega released Shinobi. Sure, on the surface, Shinobi is just a rip-off of Namco's Rolling Thunder, but it has a ninja. And ninjas were a hot property in 1987. In Shinobi, you play as Joe Musashi, and you're tasked with rescuing several kidnapped children from the clutches of the vile Ring of Five, led by the evil masked ninja. Yeah, it's not the most creative thing, but it was the 80s. Each stage has a set number of children you must rescue before moving on, and while Joe starts with just shurikens and his bare hands, rescuing some children will grant him a gun, of all things, and a sword. The game is big and colorful and tough. One hit kills Joe, although he can bump into many enemies without dying. He also gets a single use of ninja magic in each stage, which will either clear all enemies from the screen or do massive damage to the boss. This game came out in the midst of a ninja craze. Ninja Gaidens, Ninja Turtles, Sho Kosugi movies, American ninjas who possess great skill. And it was only natural that it be released for several consoles. Now, that being the case, we're going to take a look at two of the ports, Sega's very own Master System port and the NES port. Yes, you heard that right. Shinobi, a Sega game made by Sega, was ported to the NES. In the 8-bit era, Sega just hadn't quite cottoned on to the idea of console exclusives, I guess. In fact, several of their games came out for both the Famicom and the American NES. Fantasy Zone, Afterburner, and Shinobi are just a few. Now, as you can see from this funky looking cartridge, Shinobi was not a licensed NES release. It was released by Tengen here in the United States, like all of Sega's NES ports. What's interesting about this one especially, though, is that it never came out in Japan. According to the Game Developer Research Institute, Sanritsu, who would later be acquired by Sega and become a second-party studio called Sims, worked on this port for Tengen. Or at least several people from Sanritsu worked on it for Tengen, possibly as contractors. Things get a little murky around Japanese game development in the 80s. At any rate, whoever worked on it, whether it was Sanritsu proper or just members of their staff, they based it heavily on the Master System version. Enough history for you? Alright. Let's dig into these ports. The Master System port came first, released in Japan for the Mark III in July of 1988. Ported internally by Sega, it makes some significant changes to the arcade game. The first thing, rescuing the hostages is no longer necessary. However, they provide points and power-ups, so you're a fool not to do it. Secondly, there are more power-ups. Where the arcade had only a gun and a sword given at the same time, the Master System version includes separate power-ups for melee and distance weapons. The melee upgrades go from shuriken to dagger to bomb to gun. The melee track is fists and feet, then sword, nunchucks, and finally, a Manriki Gusari chain. The game also introduces a life bar, and rescuing hostages can increase said life bar and also give you a full health refill. The ninja magic is also changed and now requires you to complete one of the extremely difficult bonus stages. These were present in the arcade, but they were only for extra lives, and they were actually much easier. It doesn't really matter though, since the ninja magic is kinda useless here. The reason? You have to kill 10 enemies before you can even use it. Some levels have only few more than 10 enemies, so by the time you can use your magic, there's no longer a reason to. These are some pretty big changes. The game also takes the expected graphical hit. Now, let's talk about the NES port. Again, the NES port was not handled internally, and Tengen and Sanritsu based this version off of the Master System port, not the arcade version. Like the Master System, it does not require you to rescue the hostages, the life bar is retained, but some of the power-ups are removed. The only melee power-up here is the sword. Distance weapons of the dagger and gun are retained, but the bomb is removed. Now, the NES port also retains the changes to the ninja magic system that you see in the Master System port. This means you still have to beat one of the obnoxious bonus stages, which, to be fair, is easier on the NES version, but it's still a pain in the ass, and you still have to kill 10 enemies before you can use it, rendering it virtually useless. The biggest change the NES game makes is that 2 levels are completely remapped. Stage 2-2 and 3-2 contain vertical sections, but these sections are removed and redone as standard horizontal sections in the NES port. It's also the only version that allows you to super jump at any time. In the arcade and Master System versions, you can only do a super jump if there's an upper level section that you can jump up to, but on the NES, you can do it whenever you want. You can also attack while you're doing it, which you can't in the other versions. This makes the final boss a lot easier, as well as picking off some of the Spider-Man-like enemies that are a little more troublesome in the other versions. From a gameplay perspective, the Master System and NES versions are virtually identical. However, I would say oddly enough, the controls feel a little tighter and more responsive on the NES port. This sounds strange given the lineage, but in my experience I found it to be true. Now, as far as the arcade version goes, it plays significantly different, it's much faster paced, and the controls are much more responsive in that version. If we're comparing the 8-bit versions though, I would give the NES just a little edge in that department. As far as graphics and sound go, again, the arcade version blows them both away. It's not even a contest given the era that these games came out in. However, let's take a look and a listen to the graphics and sound in the 8-bit ports. That's not really a contest, is it? I mean, as a formality, I'll say I'll give the edge, and it goes to the arcade version, obviously. The 8-bit ports aren't terrible though, but that's not really what this episode is about. What the Summer of SEGA is about tracing the history of Sega around the 16-bit era. Now, with Shinobi, we see a game that never made it to the Genesis. It did, however, get 2 Genesis-exclusive sequels, as well as an arcade sequel that was then ported to the Genesis as well. But regular old Shinobi never quite made the cut, but it does show us some of Sega's strengths and weaknesses in the time period leading up to the Sega Genesis. Shinobi was a great arcade game. They made an almost exact duplicate of it on consoles. Now, aside from the fact that they released it for their competitor's machine, or at least allowed it to be released on their competitor's machine, definitely shows some short-sightedness on their part. But also what's really going on here is that while they're leveraging their arcade properties and doing it well, they're also not creating any new gameplay elements, or certainly not enough to increase the depth or the breadth of the gameplay to make these compelling home experiences. They don't understand the difference between a great arcade game and a great home game. That's all going to change when they release the Genesis in 1989. So come back next month, we'll talk about the launch of the Genesis and one of the first big hits to hit the console. See you next time.